The webinar will begin shortly. Please remain on the line. The webinar will begin shortly. Please remain on the line. The webinar will begin shortly. Please remain on the line. The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Good morning, everyone. We're going to give it a about a minute maybe to let everybody else log in. Hope you're enjoying your Thursday morning. We've got about, what do we got? 220 people logged in right now. So people are logging in. We'll give it a minute and get started. Thank you.
Okay. We're going to get things going while people still continue to log in. Welcome back, everyone, for day 2 of the Compost Use Best Management Practices webinar. I have posted a link in the chat that can help you find the agenda for this event. Yesterday, we learned about the composting process, how Caltrans is using compost in roadside projects, a variety of compost specifications, the U.S. Composting Council SCA program, how compost and compost filter sacks can help protect water quality, the Mountains to Sound Greenway project, compost use for forest management, and quite a bit of other stuff. Today, we will see presentations on compost use for agriculture, city projects, and urban landscaping. Just like yesterday, we will have a question and answer session after each panel. In case anyone missed the Q&A instructions yesterday or just couldn't understand me due to some technical issues that we were experiencing, here they are again. Please submit questions by typing them into the questions pane on the GoToWebinar platform, or email your questions to the Organics inbox email address that you've seen on your screen. Please send in your questions as soon as they come to you, as they will be answered in the order that they were received for the most part. And yesterday there were almost 600 attendees. We were not able to get to all questions. It seems likely that could happen again, so we'll get those questions in. If there are any questions we are unable to get to during the webinar, we will respond by email after the event. Keep in mind, the world of compost is a large topic, and today we will focus on questions or clarifications regarding material presented on today, such as compost use and recommended application rates. We're really hoping to take good advantage of the expertise of our presenters today. Jack, did you want to introduce the moderator for our first panel?
Yeah, and let me introduce you and I as well. My name is Jack Broadbent. I'll be one of your hosts today. I'm a supervising landscape architect in the Division of Design. I graduated from Cal Poly State University in San Luis Obispo in landscape architecture. And your main host, who you just heard from, is Heather Williams. She and I have joined forces. She's a senior in the organics material units at Cal Recycle and graduated from Sacramento State in the State University in environmental studies. So welcome, you guys. Some of you already heard that yesterday, but for new ones, I figured we'd introduce ourselves again. Each session for new folks, each session there's every hour a new panel, and those will be moderated. So your first moderator this morning is Kristen Pidcock. I apologize about that. Kristen, go ahead and introduce your panel. Thank you.
Awesome. Thanks, Jack.
Thank
Good
you.
morning, everyone. Welcome to the first panel of day 2. Today is all about compost use. I will be moderating our first panel, who will be discussing compost use in agriculture. First, I will introduce all of the panelists, and then we'll begin the presentations. So our first panelist is Carrie Roulet. Carrie owns a horse ranch in Plymouth, California, with 107 acres of rolling hills rangeland. He is in his second year of compost application as part of the California Department of Food and Agriculture Healthy Soils Program, with 1 year left to go. He is, his objectives for applying compost were to retain water, strengthen soil biodiversity, and limit invasive species. He has extensive equipment experience through his profession and is an advocate for compost application. Welcome, Carrie. Our next panelist is Judith Redman. Judith has been a farmer at Full Belly Farm since 1989 and an advocate for sustainable agriculture and family farming before that. Full Belly is a certified organic, multi-generational farm where cooking, eating, growing, and selling fruits, nuts, flowers, and vegetables take place year-round. Judith serves on several advisory boards, including the National Organic Farmers Association, the CDFA Science Advisory Panel, as a commissioner on the Capay Valley Fire Protection District, and on the advisory board of California Climate and Agriculture Network. Pre-COVID, Full Belly was home to many educational programs for kids and adults, as well as in events and activities for the community, like the Hose Down Harvest Festival, all of which were close to Judith's heart. Welcome, Judith. And our third panelist is Dr. Miguel Garcia. He is the Sustainable Ag Program Manager for the Napa Resources Conservation District. He provides on-farm technical assistance and planning related to soil health, nutrient management, soil erosion prevention, carbon sequestration, and irrigation management. He also designs educational programs in Spanish, aiming at providing vineyard farm workers with valuable information on various topics related to sustainable agriculture. Miguel is a certified crop advisor and has a PhD in environmental sciences and a BS in chemistry from UC Riverside. Welcome, everyone. And Carrie, the floor is yours if you're ready.
Perfect. Thank you, Kristen. So I wanted to mention to everybody how much I enjoyed yesterday and what my takeaways were. Pretty remarkable. I think I'll follow Dr. Brown's lead a little bit in that you're going to find what I tell you a little bit more of a story. We had extensive horse background. We had a ranch over in Jackson for a number of years, and everything we fed was baled hay. We had an opportunity to pick up 107 acres in the Shenandoah Valley. And when I got here, as we got started, something became very apparent early on. Now, this was a property that had not had anything happen on it except grazing since the gold miners left in the 1880s, 1890s. So my assumption was that the soils here would be in really great shape. When we began to look at the forages, the horses simply weren't eating it, or what they would eat, they were eating constantly, just never shutting down. Became aware of the invasives that were here, pretty big population of Medusa head, and star thistle literally ran the gamut from the creek to the road. So we had some challenges there, and I began to reach out for some solutions, and I got some help from the University of California, Scott Oneto, the Amador County Resource Management District was helpful. We ran some soil samples and determined that I had a soil called Awahani, and my joke here is that's Miwok for it will only grow weeds. So I was a bit skeptical. There was some discussion about if we could strengthen the soil and get some diversity, could we run those invasives off? And I know that question came up yesterday. So as we reached out for solutions, I applied for the HSP, which is a good process to go through. It's a little, there's a lot of detail to it, but in going through the exercise, it became very apparent that this process would probably benefit the soil. I was skeptical, and so I ran several tests myself here. One of the claims was that that there was an improvement in water retention. And you may laugh at this, but I actually took a hamburger press, took a couple of cups of soil from different areas, and tried to determine a week after a rain what was being held. And it was pretty impressive how much water was being held by a very small amount of compost. So we dove in head over heels. I put down 480 tons twice so far on about 60 acres with the help of the HSP. Now, my observations are predominantly anecdotal, but I think after what I heard yesterday, they're pretty impressive. We did a comment plan, which showed what we would get for carbon sequestration, and I was astounded how many cars we were in effect taking off the road. And I remember correctly, each application was the equivalent of sequestering enough carbon to remove 1,500 cars, which was a pretty big number. So we determined that we were retaining more water, but what happened next, when we first had the deliveries made of the compost, and I went at application a number of different ways, which I'll talk to when I get to my slides. But when we had the first initial dumps done, it was amazing to me the way the horses reacted to the compost. They spent hours digging around in it, rolling in it. It was almost like a party, and I couldn't quite figure out what they were so happy about. But as we made our spreads, we saw the animal life here just blossom. Gophers took off. The great birds showed up because there were insects. Insects were here and then brought the amphibians. And we had great blue heron. The raptor population doubled. I wish I had taken a more detailed inventory before I started the spread, but clearly there was a connection between what we were doing with the soil and the animals involved. I was telling Jack the other day that we actually had a bobcat come through, and she had 3 or 4 gophers, as near as I could tell, in her mouth. Well, that tells me she's feeding a baby somewhere. And then there's a coyote population here that we have a tense relationship with, but we seem to be respecting boundaries. And so our policy is try to make everything happen in balance. We put up some owl boxes. We're trying to create a balance there. But to me, the most immediate effect of the compost application was what happened with the insects, the amphibians, and the animals. The final outcome, of course, is yet to be seen. Yesterday, it was brought up: will compost help run off invasives or control weeds? I am a firm believer it will. So I'll start with my slides and show you how we approach the spreads and different ways to do it. And then at the end, I've got some more information that I just recently acquired that I will share with you. But our goal here is to retain water, run the invasives off, and get the forage quality enough where the animals could actually live on it. So what you see in my first slide there is I have a comparison. I used compost from two companies, Lopez Ag and Fassini's here in Plymouth. Both were very high quality. I got the certification paperwork. We knew what the nitrogen levels were. And so I had the big spread I had done by Lopez Ag, and I'll share with you some of that. What we see in the second half there, that's red and white clover. And that was my test patch. Again, like I said, I was a little bit skeptical of what compost would do, but in front of that barn, I had a severely damaged primitive soil, and nothing would grow except the single tap weeds. Anything that had a single tap weed could grow there, but nothing else. I put down 1/3 of a pound per square foot here, which was a little bit more than we did on our pastures. And then we overseeded with the clover, and you see the picture below. That was the result in front of our hay barn. Really, really impressive. I will tell you, I did have water through the summer to keep it moist. But now that clover is established and it's flowering and it's running on its own. Heather, you want to take me to the next slide, please? So there's a number of ways to do the spreading. You can, from a very big operation to very small. Now I did 60 acres, which was a very large application. I had 4 fields, and we have a control field off to the right where we can measure what's happening with the soil as compared to a control piece. Like I said, Lopez Ag did the bulk of the spread. Heather, let's do the next slide. I think that'll be helpful. Now, we made applications at 2 different times. I tried an application after a rain, and then I tried an application in the summertime. There's advantages and disadvantages to both. This was a summer application in field 3, and our concern was we worked early in the morning, and I kept firefighting equipment close by because I was concerned that these trucks might start a fire. We didn't have a problem. Everything that they had that could start a fire was up above, but we didn't take any chances. Recommend that if you're going to do a big spread, you do it before the first rain because it really reduces compaction and you really can see what happened with your spread. Heather, can I get the next one, please? So here's some comparisons. Now, I did this a couple of different ways. I did a small loader, and we got a 8118 Kuhn manure spreader, which would hold about 18 yards. And it worked really, really well. This happened to come off a dairy, but what I ran into was the loading and the spreading. It took me about 8 hours to do 6 acres. And when you have a big spread like that, it's better to go with a commercial company. Lopez Ag did the other 56 acres or 54 acres in about 6 hours. So it was dramatic. But for a small 1 or 2 acre plot, this kind of solution to me works pretty well. Next slide, please. So like I said, we used a small wheel loader. It took a little bit of time to load out. That was the biggest time spent. I had bulk deliveries made and then used a skid steer loader, and it did a little bit of moisture really helped with the application. And I was in a pretty good position. I had enough residual grasses that really held the compost well. If you have to spread compost on a dry surface, if it's moist, it sticks a whole lot easier. And then we did one test with a crumbler. We ran over it and actually crimped the compost into the soil, and it stuck pretty well. The other distribution method I have, and I'll mention it here, I was astounded at the way the gophers would take that material as we spread it, and they pulled it down into their holes pretty dramatically. I had some 3-foot diameter circles where every bit of that compost had been removed and taken below ground, which I think is probably a pretty good thing to have happen. Next slide, Heather. This is my effort to offset my labor trouble. We finally found some employees that we could gather and get to work, but I'm kidding, of course. But behind that is a Mule Creek manure spreader. It's about a $2,500 piece of equipment, and you can pull it with a lawn garden tractor or with a quad. And we use that to do areas that were difficult to get to. And then any area that was just in fact, I did the small test plots with this unit, and you can really regulate the amount of compost you put down. Heather, I think that's my last slide. So again, this is the test plot. This is 2 years after the initial application. We're really pleased with the results. I did do a little bit more testing. Yesterday I heard some questions about how to best spread. There's some other options out there now that are viable. I ran across a skid steer bucket that has a side discharge capability. You can see it on YouTube. And it simply goes on a skid steer loader, and you go into your pile, you pick up your material, and about a half yard to a yard could be spread at a time. And then again, there's a whole litany of pull behind equipment that could be used. And then we also we found at Home Depot a 26 by 26 by 26 square bag. And if you hand load the compost into it, it's pretty easy to move around, and you can actually hand spread it with the manure fork. So we've done that up in the rock areas where we simply can't get to. As I mentioned in conclusion here, the final outcomes are yet to be seen, but so far the results have been, to me, just absolutely astounding. I would never have thought that the soil could be impacted the way it is. We're seeing mushrooms and worms and stuff that was never here when we first came onto the property, and we think those are healthy signs for what's happening with the compost. So we're going to continue it after the HSP grant ends. We're going to figure out a way to take our areas that, as we measure the soil viability, we're going to continue this as we go forward. That's it. I'm open for questions. I hope that my little story was beneficial.
Awesome. Thank you, Carrie. Yeah, if you have questions for Carrie, please start dropping those in the chat box. Thanks for that presentation, Carrie. We're going to move to our next panelist, who is Judith Redmond. Judith, if you're ready, the floor is yours.
Hi, good morning. That was a very exciting presentation. I'm glad I got to see it. I'm glad to be here with all of you talking about compost, which is a subject that's important to me and to many farmers. I'm actually going to turn off my webcam in order to preserve my internet bandwidth because it's not always that great, but I'll be back for the questions. So in my comments, I'm going to first describe the use of, let's see, here we go. I'm going to first describe the use of compost on Full Belly Farm. And secondly, I think it's important for everyone to understand the regulatory environment faced by farmers with respect to compost. So I'll touch upon a few regulatory issues faced by farmers. And finally, one of my positions is with the California Department of Food and Agriculture Healthy Soils Program that was mentioned by Carrie. And I'm going to describe that a little bit and the way that it incentivizes compost. So, Full Belly Farm is a 400-acre certified organic farm located in Yolo County. We have very diversified practices. We grow vegetables, nuts, fruits, flowers, and grains year-round. We also have an animal program. It includes chickens and sheep. And we've been certified organic for 36 years using compost and cover crops that entire time. And the photos that you're going to be seeing here are all from Full Belly Farm. We apply about 8 tons of compost to our vegetables, nuts, and fruits. I think that's about a similar application as Carrie Roulette was using. And we always apply prior to planting. We plant things year round. Our annual cost for compost in 2021 was $96,000, which we paid $37.50 per ton, and that works out to about 2,500 tons of compost used on our farm last year. As organic farmers, we believe that the soil is a critical part of the success of our farm. And we think about fertility in very different ways than on conventionally managed farms. We think about feeding the soil as opposed to feeding crops. And when we use compost, we view it not just as a source of nutrients, but also as an aid to soil improvement and benefits such as increasing the water holding capacity of our soil, which was also mentioned by Carrie. We know that compost provides carbon, which feeds soil microbes, and those are very critical to cycling nutrients. And in organic systems, as we'll talk about a little later, carbon is equally as important as nitrogen. Full Belly Farm has used compost made from green waste, but several years ago, we switched to compost using animal products because we found that the green waste compost contained too many plastics and other waste products that we didn't want to add to our soil. This slide kind of expresses how we feel about some of the regulatory programs that we face. I guess we're kind of a little bit like the horses that on the ranch where after Carrie had applied his compost, all happy. And I'm going to talk first a little bit about food safety regulations. Back in 2008, when the Leafy Greens marketing agreement was in its formative stages, and a few years later when the FDA was writing the rules for implementation of the Food Safety Modernization Act, compost came up repeatedly as a material to be regulated for produce growers, despite the complete lack of any science linking it to illnesses related to produce. For example, the FDA proposed a 45-day interval between the application of compost and the harvest of produce from that field. Advocates believed that the waiting period was unnecessary because compost used on farms is already required to be tested pathogen-free. You can see we use a lot of the same techniques as on the ranch, on Carrie's ranch. So the burden on farms that use compost containing animal products is unscientific, and these would be produce farms. Considering the wealth of data showing that soil treated with compost is more suppressive of human pathogens than soil not treated with compost. In the end, the FDA did eliminate the 45-day harvest interval requirement, but it still exists, or even longer intervals in most food safety audits by private companies, including the company that conducts the food safety audits on Full Belly Farm. So, these concerns about the potential presence of pathogens in compost may make some growers hesitant to adopt compost if they're growing, produce. Perhaps because the compost involved in the programs that the audience is involved with, they may not include animal byproducts, so those concerns will not be so important for the farmers, in which case this could be perhaps a selling point for the compost in terms of its use by farmers growing fruits and vegetables. And just to emphasize the point about the 45-day, I made this little, this is just an excerpt from a large chart that I have with every single field that we're growing. And we have, because there's usually 3 or 4 places that any one crop might be grown at a given moment in time on our farm. And in any field, 12 crops. So if it were a simpler situation with 40 or 80 acre blocks, it would be much easier for us. But as a diversified farmer, like us, complying with the compost food safety regulations can be quite burdensome. I'm going to mention one other regulatory program, which is the Irrigated Lands Program of the State Water Resources Control Board. It was initiated in 2003 to try and prevent nitrogen from fertilizer and agricultural runoff from impairing surface and groundwater. And farmers are required to report on every field that they irrigate the crop or crops grown each year, the amount of irrigation, the amount of nitrogen applied, the yield of the crops, the nitrogen removed from the field by the crop harvest, and the nitrogen left in the field as crop residue, which is, this is the beginning. In terms of compost, those reports can be pretty intense. It turns out that only a percentage of the organically bound nitrogen applied to a field as compost is mineralized in the first year and made available to plants. And that percentage depends upon the carbon-nitrogen ratio of the compost, which the farmer will need to know. Each subsequent year, additional remaining organically bound nitrogen is mineralized from the original application. This slide is from one of the few university researchers who studies nitrogen budgets in organic soils. His name is Timothy Bowles. And there's a lot of fascinating research on nutrient cycling in organic systems, but the prevailing attitude about nitrogen fertilization is based on the conventional model in which liquid fertilizers are applied and the nitrogen is immediately available to plants. But for many of our crops, compost and cover crops are the only added source of fertility that we need to use. Because we've been using these practices for more than 30 years, we have built up a significant pool, or what we call a bank, but in this slide it's shown as a pool of nitrogen in the form of organic matter. As plants need the nitrogen, microbes break down the organic materials and release the nutrients to plant roots. Fitting the complexities and realities of organic systems into the formulas of the Irrigated Lands Regulatory Program has been quite challenging, to say the least. So if participants in the webinar find themselves advocating compost use in agriculture, I think a minimal understanding of the profound differences between nutrient cycling from compost versus nutrient cycling in conventional applications of nitrogen could be very useful. And I also just want to mention the Healthy Soils Program, which Carrie Roulette also mentioned several times. It's part of a suite of programs administered by the California Department of Food and Agriculture. And I'm on the science advisory panel to that and other programs, all of their climate smart programs, and we just sort of provide advice on implementation. And one component of this program is the financial assistance that it provides to farmers and ranchers for implementation of various conservation management practices that improve soil health, sequester carbon, and reduce greenhouse gas emissions. And as you see on the slide, since 2017, the Healthy Soil Program provided over $42 million to 640 different projects on farms and ranches. And farmer demand for funding from the program has increased sixfold in just 3 years. It now includes more than 25 management practices that are eligible for incentive grants. And compost application is just one of those practices, and it outpaced all the others and was included in 72% of the funded projects. CDFA pays a flat rate reimbursement, which I think is $50 a ton. And yeah, there's a lot of exciting research into the use of compost as a conservation practice. Hey, that's the wrong slideshow. So there it is. That's my slide. Anyway, I think just the application of compost over large ranch acreages is one of those areas, and other new approaches and applications for compost are being discussed as part of the Healthy Soils Program. So thank you very much. That completes my presentation, and I will be here to take questions later.
Thank you, Judith. That was a very informative presentation. If you have any questions for Judith, please start sending those our way, and we will get to our questions after our final panelist, which is Dr. Miguel Garcia. Welcome, Miguel. The floor is yours.
Hello, everyone. Can you hear me fine? Can you hear me fine?
Yes.
Can we go to the first slide, please? Thank you. Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for the invitation. I'm very happy to be here. As my introduction said, I'm currently working for the Napa Valley Resource Conservation District. But before coming here, I was working for the Coachella Valley Resource Conservation District in Southern California. And today is going to be the topic of my talk, just discussing a project that I did while I was doing some work down there. Next slide, please. Before I get started, I'm going to share with you a little bit about what resource conservation districts are, since that's what I've been working for my entire career. The RCDs, short for Resource Conservation District, you can find those all over the country. And in California, there's one in almost every county. They originated out of the Dust Bowl era. Because as you know, poor land management practices during the Dust Bowl drought of the 1930s resulted in an environmental disaster that shook the nation into recognizing that soil erosion is a menace to the national welfare. So RCDs were funded through the country along with the USDA's branch that eventually became the Natural Resource Conservation District, or NRCS for short. And both the NRCS and the RCDs have the common goal of improving resource management in both agricultural and natural settings. Next slide, please. This is my team. At the Napa RCD, we are a very diverse group, just like other RCDs with various skill sets. I personally manage the sustainable agriculture programs, but we also have people working on forestry, various environmental issues in lakes and rivers, erosion prevention, education, and other topics. Next slide, please. Before working for the Napa RCD, I worked for the Coachella RCD, and this gave me an opportunity to work with Hispanic farmers and to do some work related to farming in arid regions, which in the Coachella Valley, as we know, is very hot and dry. Next slide, please. As you know, farming in this kind of environment can be very difficult. Some of the issues that farmers face in these regions are water scarcity, poor water quality, extreme hot temperatures, which causes excessive water evaporation from the soil, which in turn can cause soil salinization. At the same time, arid soils are inherently inadequate for farm production because they have very low organic matter content, which affects the soil's ability to retain water and nutrients. And this low organic matter also means low cation exchange capacity, which is going to affect how the soil can mobilize and retain nutrients. Next slide, please. We sometimes use this model to represent what an ideal soil is supposed to look like. So in this model, we see that roughly 50% of the pore space is where water and air exchange occurs. About 45% is mineral content, and about 5% should be organic matter. And typically, fertile soils in California can have organic matter content between 3 and 5%, or even a little higher than that, depending on management practices. In the desert, soils typically have very, very low organic matter, and it is not rare to see organic matter content lower than 1%. And this can limit significantly what the soil can do. Next slide, please. Organic matter is at the center of biological, physical, and chemical properties in the soil, and it therefore directly affects soil health. The low levels of organic matter in desert soils limits their fertility and the ability to function as proper agricultural soils. Nonetheless, humans have found ways to make it work. And case in point is the extremely good ability of Native American tribes in the Southwest to grow corn in the desert without irrigation. So if the Native tribes can do it, there's a way of doing it. It's just extremely difficult. Next slide, please. This right here represents the carbon cycle. Organic matter in the soil is about 50% carbon, and it comes from the decomposition of plant material and soil organisms. The carbon cycle begins at the plant photosynthesis. So when plants absorb carbon dioxide from the atmosphere and produce hydrocarbons or sugars, they use that as a source of energy. But at the same time, plants have a symbiotic relationship with soil microorganisms, where plants would give a good chunk of the sugar that they produce to these microorganisms because the microorganisms will help the plant process and mobilize nutrients. And when these microorganisms die, they contribute to the organic matter pool, which will feed other microorganisms, and that continues the cycle. And a well-balanced carbon cycle will result in the overall accumulation of organic matter in the soil. And higher soil organic matter content is typically linked to better soil health. Now, this picture right here represents a natural ecosystem. In an agricultural operation, depending on the soil management practices, this cycle can be disturbed, and that can impact soil organic matter levels and therefore have a significant impact on the general soil health. Next slide, please.
Miguel, you have about 2 minutes.
Thank you. So the NRCS, the USDA promotes different practices to improve and retain organic matter. I don't have time to talk about that, but I suggest you guys reach out to USDA and NRCS if you want to learn more about it. Next slide, please. This right here provides some insight into how compost can benefit organic matter levels in the soil. With compost applications, you're literally bringing organic matter, carbon from another place and importing to your soil. But this organic matter is going to kickstart the biology of the soil, and that is going to enhance that carbon cycle. So the organic matter is like a savings account. You put in a certain amount, but it's going to give you more than your initial investment. Just because of that biological enhancement. Next slide, please. So to investigate this in the Coachella Valley, we decided to establish a trial site. For this, we picked a date farm in Mecca, just north of the Salton Sea. Next slide, please. This was a 20-acre planted date farm irrigated with well water. Next slide, please. The organic matter of this soil was very low, around 0.5%, and the well water they were using was high in salinity, and the salt was accumulating in the soil, and this was affecting the productivity. The plants look very unhealthy. They were not producing good yields. The leaves looked very pale. So we came in, next slide, please, and we incorporated compost at a rate of 20 tons per acre, down to 6 inches, and then we cover it with wood chips to protect the compost. Next slide, please. Now, I was there only for 1 year, and then I moved to Northern California, so I only have preliminary results. But after just 1 year of application of compost, we saw soil salinity drop to 12%. And the farmer started noticing benefits to the plants. He started noticing the leaves looking more green. He started noticing increased yields. Now, I wasn't there long enough to look at exactly what's going on in the soil, but we suspect that these the addition of the organic matter from the compost was introducing nutrients and increasing the soil cationic exchange capacity of the soil, therefore displacing the sodium and allowing the plant to be able to absorb nutrient and water more efficiently. So we saw a quick turnaround for this project. Next slide. Now, for me, because we couldn't look at all the science, to me, the most important thing is the farmer's perception. And the farmer felt very happy. The farmer felt like the plants look healthier. He was very happy with the yields. And here I show you a picture. On top is a date that came out of that trial site farm. And below is a date that came from a neighboring farm. Now, the date on the top here still needs to go through the drying process. So the size is a little bit, the comparison is not completely true. But yet, I mean, this date was much bigger than what we are expecting or what the farmer had seen in the past. This picture was actually taken by a neighbor who actually I tried to convince to be part of the trial, and she was not interested. One day she just sent me this picture and say, hey, what is going on with my neighbor's dates? Whatever you're doing, can you do it with me as well? Unfortunately, I wasn't there long enough to keep working with this farmer, but I was very happy to see that the word was spreading, that the farmer that was participating was very happy and was very willing to continue participating, and noticing that the neighbors were actually putting attention was very a good thing. So I wasn't there long enough. Next slide, please. I wasn't there long enough to be able to keep track of this. I really hope the farmer is doing well. To me, the most important thing is that he felt happy and that he felt that there were significant improvements happening. So this is just showing you a promising thing that compost applications can do in area regions. You might not see this quick of an improvement in soils that already have adequate organic matter, but in the desert where we're dealing with very, very low organic matter, compost can have very quick improvements. So if you're farming in a desert region, I really encourage you to look into compost applications. Thank you.
Thank you, Miguel. That was a great presentation on the benefits of composting application. We're going to check in with Esmeralda and Ray to begin the question and answer session. So please start sending your questions now.
Thank you, Kristen. We got our first several questions are for Carrie. People would like to know what kind of compost was used and at what thickness or rate, what equipment was used to spread material, and lastly, if it was applied onto untilled soil.
Okay, so I'll unpack that. That has several pieces to it. I got certified soil as specified by the HSP. It had been run through a screed, so it was very, very small. I put 8 tons per acre was my application rate. And what was the other? There was a couple more parts to that question.
Sorry, it was what kind of compost was used, and then the equipment that was used, and if it was applied onto untilled soil.
We did put it on untilled soil, and like I said, I did 3 different methods of application. We did what I would call a commercial application with the big spreaders, 26 tons at a whack. I did it with a small machine, which was the 8118, which was towed by a 70-horse John Deere tractor. And then we also did it with a Caterpillar skid steer loader and a side discharge bucket. So depending on the size, we tried to match it and where I needed to go. And again, I was up on a hill with a lot of granite outcropping. So some of the smaller machines worked really well up there. You obviously can't take a big truck up on a hillside, although the Lopez Ag guys scared me more than once with the approach of the hill they took. But I hope that answers your question. Oh, I'm sorry. The compost was all from green waste too. There was no animal products in it. It was green waste.
Thank you. The next question is to Judith, and it is regarding the compost composition also of what was used. The audience would like to know if anything was added to that compost, including other organic fertilizers. And Ruben from Marin Sanitary would like to know if you also incorporated compostable plastics in those compost blends.
Yeah, we purchased our compost off farm. We didn't make it ourselves. And as I mentioned, we had 2 different companies, one which was green waste, and then the second one that we use now, which does include animal byproducts. And we almost always mix our compost with gypsum. And I don't know if you noticed in that pile, I think that was in one of the slides, there might have been some white powder that you saw, and that's gypsum that we use when we apply the compost. And we use a compost spreader and a front end loader similar to what was in several of Carrie Roulette's photos and slides. And so we're mostly applying the compost on ground that we're tilling, because we turn over our crops pretty regularly. And so we have a lot of tillage going on, although we're experimenting pretty extensively with growing our organic produce using no-till, a no-till approach. And so, yeah, the plastic, we actually don't want plastic. I'm not sure I understood the question very well, but we're actually not looking to have plastic in our compost. And we found that there was plastic and other kinds of waste in the compost that we use that was from green waste. That was a big problem.
Thank you. We also have a follow-up to that. What is the gypsum for?
It's just good for our soil. Our soil tends towards a little bit of alkalinity, and the gypsum can be just helpful as an amendment. It's not a fertilizer. It's just simply a soil conditioner, and we don't use any other additives to our compost except for the gypsum. And on many of our crops, that's the only what people think of as fertilizer that we're using on some of our what we call heavy feeders, like maybe our tomatoes. We do use other fertilizers in addition to the compost.
Thank you, Judith. The next question comes from John Wong, and they would like to know, how do you certify organic when using compost?
So that's another question for me. Yes. Getting certified is a process of going through a transition away from certain practices that aren't allowed in organic production. And there's a farm plan that you create that outlines your ways of increasing biodiversity, improving the soil. And many farmers that are practicing organically use compost and also grow cover crops and those kinds of things. So compost is actually one of the fundamental building blocks of organic agriculture and has been for the 30 years and 35 years that we've been practicing it. Some of the practices like cover crops are hard for farmers to incorporate, but they're very important because in most organic agriculture, although it is changing, unfortunately, but in most organic practices, the soil is very much the basis of the farm health. So yeah, compost is really a very fundamental part of many organic farms.
Hey, I wanted to ask a question. I wanted to go back. There was an interesting question, and it was regarding compostable plastics. I think was specifically the question. And I actually went to the sites, and I ended up getting plastic, whether I liked it or not. Get a little bit of glass here and there, no metal at all. But I don't think there's enough combustible or compostable plastics in the system yet to be able to tell whether it's beneficial or not.
Yeah, yeah, we use plastic mulch covers, plastic covers on our beds at times, especially during the drought. We found that it really decreased water needs for our crops. So we have a lot of plastic in our system, and we know that there's organic plastic available that would break down, but it's super expensive on our scale. And so we generally don't use it. And the plastics that we were finding in the compost were as contaminants, is what we felt were definitely not biodegrading.
Thank you both for that insight and bringing us back to that point. So the next question is compost recommended for top dressing lawn areas? This person, Michael Ferrara, said that they found it attracted too many skunks and raccoons and ruined the lawn.
I think that's where we're out of whack with the environment itself. The reason they're there is because now there's something to eat that's not there. And I think in areas like that, it's going to be a challenge because we're out of balance. You don't have the other animals to keep them away or the predators to keep them away. I would recommend trying it. I can't believe the skunks would get enough out of a small compost application, make much difference, but maybe they do. We're putting it on our lawns.
Leah Webb has a question regarding invasive species. How do you eliminate the invasives, especially star thistle will be in the seed bank? How does the nitrogen in the compost actually help the invasives, and how do you outcompete them?
So great question. I spent a lot of time on this. So when I started with the star thistle removal before I started with the compost, and what we discovered, I did a 1% glyphosate application because we had it so thick you couldn't walk through the field. So I did a 1% broadcast after all the native grasses had gone dormant. And I documented and sent actually to the University of California. We disrupted the seeds pretty dramatically. There's a debate. The seed life on yellow star thistle appears to be 3 or 4 years. So I'm in my 3rd year. We're about 97% contained. First year was the spray. The second year, we did enough damage to the seed bank that I had about 1/3 less, which we were able to then spot treat with 1% glyphosate. And I'm not a fan of glyphosate, but you don't have a choice. And then this year we were able to hand pull. When I look at my test patch and where I put compost, my fescues and bromes are 20 and 30% more robust, and I'm doing that by length. About 6 inches in my test plot, about 10 inches in the general pastures where we've applied it. And Scott Oneto, who I work with, has a theory. We're going to see how it works. We think that as those native grasses get stronger, the star thistle will not have the capability it currently has. And I don't know if you know the star thistle at all, but it actually puts out a colony. And as it builds outward, it actually puts toxins in the soil to kill competing plants. And then it also removes all the water and stores it in its stems. So you've got to break that chain, and you better have a 3 to 5 year commitment because it's coming back. There's about 15 million acres in California, I am told, of yellow star thistle. So no matter what I do, it's going to be back here sooner or later. So for us, it's going to be an ongoing plan. We are going to try some rotational grazing with goats and see if we can catch the babies before they get going, because my goal is to not use any chemicals on it at all. That remains to be seen. Yellow star thistle is tough. It is tough. It's an invasive species. It came from Europe in the 1850s, and it's been here ever since unchecked.
I think we have about time for one more quick question.
Okay, we'll jump down then to some of these questions that are just coming in. Coachella Valley has a lot of agriculture. Are farmers resistant to adding compost to their fields? If so, what are the barriers that farmers cite?
I think just like any other agricultural operation, if they have never tried it, they might be a little apprehensive to see what the benefits will be and what the drawbacks will be. It's expensive, so you need to be prepared. For the study that I mentioned, we paid for the compost, we paid for the delivery. We only asked the farmer to put in the compost on the ground. So with that, the goal was to eventually get more funding to continue doing that. I'm not sure what the Coachella city is doing right now, but I think that this is the same reason everywhere else I work up here in Northern California as well, is that sometimes people don't know really what the benefits, the full potential of the compost. So if it's going to be an additional cost to the operation, they need to make sure that it's going to work. So we always have those early adopters that are going to jump at it and be the ones that are going to demonstrate the benefits, like the two panelists we have here, and then we have some farmers that are going to wait until some other people try it. The Healthy Soils program is making good strive on changing that, providing the cutting off the cost for the farmers. But I think that word of mouth as well, like it happened in my example, where neighbors realize that other people are facing the same problems and that they finding a solution to those problems through the compost applications, can have a lot of promise.
Yeah, I mean, another shout out to the Healthy Soils program of the California Department of Food and Agriculture. It is hard for farmers to try new things because they have small margins and not a lot of time. And the expense around compost isn't just associated with the cost of the compost and the freight of getting the compost to your farm. It's also associated with the labor of applying the compost, the labor and the machinery, which in California is quite expensive. So all of those things make it, the farmer's going to need to understand what the benefits are and have a long-term commitment to these kinds of experimental approaches. So I think if we want to see, some movement towards mitigating and dealing with the climate emergency and biodiversity and some of the other environmental goals that some of us think about, it's really true that we're going to have to support a land-based solution across the whole agricultural landscape.
All right, that concludes our panel on compost use in agriculture. I wish we had more time, but we're going to take a quick break. I'd like to thank the audience for all your questions. Thank you, Esmeralda and Ray, for facilitating the question and answers. A special thank you to Miguel, Carrie, and Judith for your time and expertise this morning. We will resume back at 10. Until then, here's something to chew on.
Can you hear me?
Sounds good. Okay, well, I hope that everyone had a nice quick break. Welcome back. My name is
Can't hear you.
Angel Fong, and I work as an environmental scientist at CalRecycle. And today I will
Angel,
be
I
moderating
can't hear
for
you,
this
Angel.
panel called Compost Use in the City. I'd like to start off by welcoming and introducing our team presenters, Peter Schultz-Allen and David Franklin.
Okay.
Peter is a senior scientist at EOA Incorporated, and he has extensive experience in the fields of green stormwater infrastructure, litter reduction, zero waste policy, complete and green streets, sustainable landscaping, and urban forestry practices. He previously managed the environmental programs for the city of Emeryville, and since joining EOA in 2013, he has been providing GI, LID, and litter-related technical assistance and program support to staff around the Bay Area. Welcome, Peter. Our second presenter is David Franklin. He is a nationwide presenter and award-winning landscape professional with over 40 years of experience in green industry, including 25 years in construction site erosion control and industrial stormwater quality sectors. He has worked on stormwater issues as a consultant, specifier, contractor, sampling technician, and inspector on a wide variety of projects. So thank you both to coming today and for your time. And Peter, you can take it away whenever you're ready.
Okay, great. Thank you. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. All right. Well, yeah, I'm really impressed by the lineup of speakers yesterday and today.
Oh, sorry, Peter, you're muted right now.
Oh.
We can hear him, Angel. You two don't be able to hear each other, but we can hear both of you.
Okay. All right. Great. Yeah. So, and I'll be advancing the slides myself. Is that right?
Yeah, it should work right now.
Okay.
There you go.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. There's a little delay, right? So, yeah, I'm going to talk about for you municipal staff out there or people who are interested in how municipalities use compost and my experience from working in the city of Emeryville. I was there for 11 years from 2002 to 2013. And when I started there, I was kind of a recycling and compost professional, but I learned a lot about stormwater and I did a lot of building inspections and sediment and erosion control. So I started experimenting with some things and talking to staff and asking about what we could do there. So I'm going to talk about that a little bit today, but I also want to bring up just a bunch of different topics, and I call them drivers. So, you could say policy mechanisms or policy drivers for municipal compost and mulch use. And none of these are really new to anybody probably here, but I thought it'd be good to summarize them. Of course, right now, or in the last year, we've had the drought issues and the water efficient landscape ordinance. So that's a big one. Climate change, as people were talking about today, and sequestering carbon. I wrote the climate action plan for the city of Emeryville. I don't think we actually talked about compost that much in that plan in 2008, but there were a few parts related to it, and at least related to compost. So, and then SB 1383, a much newer issue for a lot of municipalities, and complying with that, especially the procurement requirements. I'm sure there'll be some discussion of that, or maybe there was yesterday. I wasn't able to attend all the sessions yesterday. Fire remediation, I think this is a really interesting one, and we need a lot more research on this, but it does, from some research that I've looked at, it does appear that composted wood mulch is more resistant to catching on fire, or it seems to be less flammable. And so that could help with fire prevention. And then, of course, there's a lot of ways to use compost and mulch after fires as well. And using compost for your urban forestry program, we really want to have large trees, and that was something that was really, there was a lot of work that needed to be done in Emeryville. It has, at the time, the lowest canopy coverage percentage of a city in the Bay Area. I think it was under 5%, and that has started to improve. What I do now in my current work, I help municipalities comply with the stormwater permits that they have in the Bay Area. And specifically in green stormwater infrastructure, we use a lot of landscaping, and we use a lot of mulch and compost in those systems. And then for construction sites, and David's going to talk about that. But I will talk a little bit about construction sites and some of the BMPs that are used. But what I also want to talk about is how to specify compost and mulch, and for municipal uses in particular. And this is something that I've been working on more. The specification for that, those green stormwater infrastructure systems, we have a very particular biotreatment soil media and the compost that's used in that. And recently we also started creating specifications for wood mulch for these biotreatment systems too. And so when I was in Emeryville, I started looking at our construction site inspection program that was related to the stormwater program, and seeing if we could exceed some of the standard practices there. But first, what construction and landscape projects, for your own projects, of course, your capital improvement program, you can, to comply with SB 1383, some of these are ways that you can help with that procurement requirement there. And so you can direct the agency purchases of compost-based erosion and sediment control, best management practices, or BMPs. If you're requiring a contractor to use a compost-based erosion and sediment control BMP, there is a way. It's a little, I think, trickier with a private site. If it's your own project, though, so if you're, say, building a new police station in your city, and you're requiring contractors to use those compost-based erosion and sediment controls, then you can get credit for that with the SB 1383 requirements. And then, of course, using compost and mulch in the landscapes and stormwater bioretention areas, and in roadway projects like green street projects, or where you're planting new street trees. Yeah, so on the related to compost and mulch, on construction sites, there's these temporary construction measures or temporary BMPs that use compost and mulch. And so there's the socks, the berms and blankets. And then sometimes you're also putting down a temporary vegetated cover that might be using compost or mulch. And then when the permanent construction measures, so the final vegetation that will be planted, and if you have any of those green stormwater measures, like low impact development or LID, GSI, the green stormwater infrastructure, those systems also, as I mentioned, use compost and mulch. Here's an example of a compost-based BMP. This is a sock, a compost sock, and it's filled with a very coarse compost. It looks more like composted wood mulch to me, but technically it's a coarse compost as opposed to a finer compost that you might use more in the soil or as a soil amendment. And as you can see here, it's on an impervious surface. So it's protecting a storm drain or an inlet in a parking lot in this case. And the water is kind of ponding up there. And then this BMP is filtering that water. And so clean water is going down the drain as opposed to the muddy water that you kind of see there. And this application, for this type of location, this is a much better application, a much better BMP to use than what sometimes you'll see people using a straw wattle or a straw-filled sock. And those just don't work very well on an impervious surface like this. And so in Emeryville, we have a lot of impervious surfaces, and we have a lot of flat area. There's really not a lot of slope or hilly areas in Emeryville. And so I started to see that this type of BMP was much more applicable and much more useful in the city, but it wasn't the standard practice. So we had to come up with an argument for why we should require these as opposed to the kind of more standard straw wattles. Here's another example of how they can, of this compost-based BMP or this compost sock can be used around the perimeter of a stock pile. If it's being actively used, and it doesn't have to be covered because it's actively being used. Then you can use this around the perimeter. Here's another example from an Emeryville site. This is very common that you have sidewalk next to the construction site. And we just found that these compost socks were much more effective at kind of the perimeter control than a straw wattle or a straw sock. Yeah, here's that same site. It goes all the way around the perimeter. Now, in this location, it's on the soil, but it could also be, and I think it's the most effective location is when it's on the soil right next to the fence. So there's oftentimes a couple inches of grade difference when it goes up to the sidewalk level. So that helps the sock perform better. But I have seen them also put onto the sidewalk outside of the fence there. And that can also work, but I think it works more effectively here and it's on the inside, so it's less likely to be vandalized or tampered with. One problem I have seen in mulch, as Judy mentioned, and compost is that sometimes you get contamination. And film plastic tends to be one of the more types of plastic contamination. And it's not something we really want to have in any use, because a lot of times you're trying to reduce trash and litter or reduce contamination, and so we don't want to see that in the compost. So that is something I think the quality is getting better, and this is hopefully they will continue to go down over time. And this is something that we also look very carefully at in our composted mulch specification for biotreatment areas. We have a very low tolerance for film plastic in particular. So my recommendations for public agency staff, if you're going to consider doing something like Emeryville did, where you want to kind of go above and beyond what the standard practice is, and so in this case, talking about using that compost sock as a required minimum instead of the straw wattle. So you have to, of course, have a rationale for that. And in my experience, there were certain types of situations where this compost sock worked a lot better. But are there specific things about your jurisdiction or your geography or soil type or climate that you can use? And in our case, it was that flat. It was Emeryville is very flat, and we had a lot of these impervious surfaces, and so the straw wattle just wasn't as useful in a lot of those locations. And you want to quantify or qualify the performance standards as much as possible. You don't want to use a brand name, so that can bring up issues of sole sourcing, which you don't want to do. So if you can describe the type of BMP and in the specification, or the type of system that you want, or the type of product, you describe the characteristics of it. That's better than using a brand name. You can sometimes say, for example, or but then you want to also, I think in my next slide here, we talked about so as an example, or you could say or equal, but you want to make sure you use that as approved by your agency. So you fill in the blank there. And in this case, it was as approved by the city of Emeryville, so that the private sector person doesn't get to choose what's equal. It should be you that's choosing that. And there may be other companies or products out there that you're not aware of, so you want to make sure that you think about that. Let's see. Considering exemptions, yes, you want to make sure that you have that situation where maybe you haven't thought of a certain situation, and someone says, well, what about this situation? So you do want to consider or have something about exemptions. And look for other agencies, especially public agencies, that are creating specifications that you can leverage, such as Caltrans or CalRecycle or AASHTO. So those are all good organizations to look to. One other example I wanted to bring up is something that used to be more common, but with the MWELO the water efficient landscape ordinance. This is less common now, but it used to be, especially in the Bay Area, I would see situations or municipal codes that require this nitrified soil conditioner, which is, my understanding is that it's basically where you take like sawdust, a forest waste product or a lumber milling waste product, and then they add liquid nitrogen fertilizer to it, and it turns it black, and then they can call it a soil amendment that has a lot of nitrogen in it. Well, it's not a very sustainable practice, and using that urea or liquid nitrogen can be detrimental to soil microbes and organisms in the soil. So in Emeryville, we said, well, what if we just change it to compost? And so for Emeryville, it was originally, I think, 3 cubic yards of this NSC or nitrified soil conditioner per 1,000 square feet of landscaping. And so we changed that. Originally, it was 3 cubic yards of compost. And per city standards is a very important phrasing you want to use, or verbiage, because per city standards means that then you get to decide that as the city staff person who oversees that program, and it can change over time, and it can be flexible. So it went up to 6 cubic yards of compost, and also it can be integrated into other programs like the WELO chapter of your municipal code. And you want it, I like using that per city standards or per agency standards for that flexibility. Also consider requiring types or categories of products that are flexible. So maybe you have compost or mulch or filter socks, and there's several different types of products there, and rationales for those criteria. In Emeryville, we wanted to try to complete that nutrient cycle. So we have in the city, there's companies that collect organic waste materials. And now that's required with SB 1383. At the time, it wasn't required, but we had several companies collecting those types of materials, and we wanted to see if they were turning it into compost, and if we could bring those compost products back into the city. So we were specifying that you had to use compost, and it had to be produced by one of those companies, and there were several, so that was good. And there are other programs like from the U.S. Composting Council, as I mentioned, or Stock Waste in Alameda County, where Emeryville is, that are very useful, and Rescape California also, or formerly known as the Bay Friendly Coalition. There's a lot of great information and great programs out there that you can leverage. Cost is an issue, and you want to make sure that it's not something that's going to be, exorbitant in price, or these days, I guess that could also be an issue with, delays in materials. But hopefully that's not a problem with these compost-based BMPs if they're being produced within the state of California. So compost makes up 30 to 40% of the biotreatment soil media in stormwater landscapes like this one that's in Campbell. And we have, as I mentioned, these Bay Area specifications that require that planting media to contain that compost. I did mention Rescape California. They had these great 8 principles for regenerative landscapes. I'm not going to go into this too much because we have some other presentations later, and I'm sure they'll go into this in their presentations, but compost and mulch is a big part of that. And as Judy mentioned, feeding the soil is the main principle there. And then finally, I just wanted to show an example of renovating a bioretention area in a parking lot. Here's some before pictures, removing the weeds and some of the dead plants in this location here. And then we were putting in new plants and compost and mulch. This is over in San Mateo County. There's our pile of compost that we got, and pile of mulch. And this did have a little bit of foam plastic in it, but it wasn't too bad. So we were able to just pick that out. And this is what it looked like at the end after it was replanted. And I think that might be, oh, and then I just wanted to mention this new specification that we have for composted wood mulch in biotreatment landscapes. And we just found that this composted wood mulch really works the best, and it has all these benefits. Wood mulch in general is good, especially if it's a recycled product, so that it's created locally and it's not coming from far away, or it's better to use that. That we did find there are certain types of mulches though that are really not very. The worst is probably the micro bark mulch, because it moves around a lot and is very it floats. The bark floats the most, and because it's uniform in size, it's just the most problematic. This spec uses the existing Caltrans coarse compost. There's also the medium and fine ones. And I think I'm finishing up. Am I out of time, Angel?
You have 5 more minutes.
Oh, okay, great. So maybe I've talked very quickly, but that's good. We can leave more time for Q&A, hopefully. And so this Bay Area specification, this is new, just came out this year. We have it posted on a couple websites. There's one here at the bottom from the Santa Clara Valley Urban Runoff Pollution Prevention Program, or SCUVERP. That's one of the programs that we work with, and helping those municipalities in Santa Clara County. There are several Bay Area suppliers that have said they can meet this specification. As I mentioned, one of the main challenges is the trash, those inerts, especially plastic film, and the green waste composts, in our experience, have tended to be cleaner and have less of that material. So I was a little surprised that Judy mentioned that, but of course there's all different compost processors around the state, and we tend to see that the municipally derived, and maybe that's what maybe she meant, is that the composts that come from a municipal collection tend to have more contamination. If it's the landscape maintenance companies trimming trees or trimming landscapes and bringing that material to a composter, that tends to be cleaner. But as I said, a lot of Bay Area composters are working on this, and they're cleaning up their and improving their compost and their mulch. So it's getting better, I think, all the time. And this is going to be a critical aspect of helping cities and counties comply with SB 1383, the procurement parts of that. So we're excited about this new specification and hope that people can use it. And see if I have anything else here. Yeah, so that's the end of my presentation. Here's my contact information if you want to send me an email, or we can talk more about any of these things and this subject. And I'm happy to be here today and glad that I could make this presentation. So thank you very much.
Great, thank you so much for that presentation. If you have any questions, please drop it in the chat box or the organics inbox. And now we will move on to our next presentation. David, please start whenever you're ready.
Okay, thanks, Angel. Yes, my name is David Franklin, and this is my company, Envirotech NPDS Services. Project here is where we were finishing off a construction project and used compost products to achieve stabilization and minimize impact to water quality. So as a practitioner in the field for many years, been a fan of compost products, and as a stormwater compliance person, I've interfaced with a lot of permittees who are concerned about water quality and how compost products might impact water quality in the receiving waters. And let's see here. There we go. So, there's the concern some folks have about fluoride in our drinking water. And indeed, there was a movie in the 60s in which this fellow was certain the Russians were putting fluoride in our drinking water to take over our minds. So what's the correlation? Well, indeed, we do have concerns for our receiving water bodies, some of them being impaired for nutrients and eutrophication, excessive plant growth, and oxygen depletion impacting aquatic life is a concern. But the question we have to ask is compost the source? And more likely, compost is going to reduce the negative impacts to water quality when projects are successfully implemented using compost. So this photo shows us that ostensibly the production of compost can be a source of stormwater runoff of concern and air emissions. But I wanted to point out that, the State Water Resource Control Board does have a general order for composting operations. And composting operations are heavily regulated so that practices are implemented and water quality sampling is implemented also. And as a result, facilities are being constructed increasingly that have structural and proprietary designs. And like in this photo here, the windrows of compost are placed on slanted floors so that the leachate will drain off and be collected, and it does not discharge to the environment. It's recycled on site. And you notice also some of the windrows have a cover over the windrow. And so increasingly we're seeing advanced engineering, automation, and monitoring with these designs. And so the compost production is truly controlling negative air emissions and stormwater runoff. And even to the extent that there are facilities which can qualify for a NONA. A NONA is a notice of non-applicability. That means that the facility is so well engineered that the threat of a discharge is eliminated. So the facility does not have discharges of stormwater off-site, and therefore they are able to not need the permit because of a lack of discharges. Okay. This drawing here shows the greater concept of a composting facility layout. And you can see there's a stormwater retention pond in the top there, which would receive the perimeter runoff from the facility at large, even though the windrows might be, containing all the leachate and not discharging anything. There are other stormwater discharges throughout the facility, which are being controlled at the stormwater pond. But I have circled the truck leaving the facility. And so in my view, the perhaps biggest risk we're going to be seeing for the increased use of compost in our different municipalities is the transport and distribution of the finished product. Because when the finished product reaches distribution centers, the regulations governing the production of the compost are no longer governing. And so nutrients and particulates may be transported by wind and rain exposure, and the biological processes in these piles may continue to produce additional nutrient loads. And so municipalities may need stricter requirements for commercial and municipal operations. And, I'm thinking of going into the easy up business where, can have a truck driving around and having for sale these quick protective covers before a rain. So that's actually just a joke, but we can see that there's opportunity to have different designs, and protecting these piles from raindrop impact is probably something to be looking at, as well as certainly protecting the drainage systems in the facility, in the commercial distribution center, and in the perimeters, where we may have, as Peter was mentioning, different landscape solutions where vegetation intercepts the runoff, or even these products like compost socks that can intercept and hold the pollutants from leaving the facility. So that is something that is probably on the horizon: increased controls and design at these distribution centers. But so first we talked about the production of compost and how it's regulated. And then I just mentioned the distribution point perhaps being the weakest point in a threat to water quality. And the third topic is our final design and implementation of the compost in the landscape. And let's take a look at that. We have in this photo some walls of seeded compost-filled socks with irrigation. And these walls can quickly become vegetated. And as Peter mentioned, there are many kinds of applications for compost. You've got the socks or a spread out blanket of compost that will grow plants. A mulch can be used for holding moisture down and suppressing weeds. Compost can be incorporated into the soil profile. And ultimately, when compost is part of the overall erosion control, that is one of our best points of control for water quality protection. So when it comes to concerns about stormwater quality and compost, perhaps three main topics would be runoff versus infiltration, and the threat of a first flush, and any overall increase in pollutant loading in the stormwater runoff. And, you know, if we talk about infiltration, when we have properly implemented compost designs, if we look at this wall is like 4 feet deep. And how much rain does it take to actually leave that wall? We saw photos previously where the compost absorbs and holds moisture. So it's going to take quite a large rain event for anything to ever leach out of that compost sock wall. It really retains the rain. It doesn't discharge the rain except in an extremely long and extended rain event. So the threat of a first flush, even though there might be some, there typically is some available nitrogen in a compost product. The threat of a first flush is not very high because it absorbs the rain. And so overall, the pollutant loading with compost applications is reduced, not increased. And let's do a discussion on comparing traditional methods to compost utilized projects. In this photo, we see what's probably a subsoil being seeded with mulch and fertilizer. So chemical fertilizer on a slope like this, imagine the rain's coming, and this soluble fertilizer will start to dissolve and leave the site as stormwater runoff. There are no grasses growing. It's a quick release discharge off the project. And so that's our traditional approach. And do we hear anybody asking that we stop doing that? We don't. We do it all the time. What we do all the time is topsoiling or hydroseeding or rolled erosion control products, also called blankets, or straw applications, or sediment controls, meaning barriers or berms. And these traditional methods are, based on studies, more of a negative impact to water quality than well-designed compost applications. And this photo shows us that the compost blanket above is actually drinking the rainwater. It's not discharging rainwater and nutrients. And the reason we can conclude that is because in the bottom half of the photo, we have the traditional hydroseeding and straw rolls. But the esoteric observation is that in between the highest straw roll and the compost blanket, there is virtually no erosion. The erosion actually occurs where the fiber rolls are successfully installed and create a ponded condition on top of the saturated silty soils. And this means that erosion occurs discharges occur. And when sediments leave, commonly the sediments include, chemical attachment to metals and nutrients. And so we do have discharges in our eroded conditions that impact water quality. Again, the compost blanket is not discharging, it's growing vegetation, which protects water quality.
Oh, Peter, sorry, David, you have 5 more minutes.
Okay, thanks. And so the findings from studies resulted in concluding that nutrient concentrations from compost can vary depending on the different feedstocks. If there is a first flush, there can be a higher pollutant concentration than later runoff. Amending the soil greatly increases infiltration, which reduces runoff. And increased infiltration reduces erosion and the total pollutant loads in the runoff. And dischargers of NPDES permits are responsible in the end for their designs. And so if we talk about municipalities approving projects and doing plan review and making sure installations are inspected and installed correctly, let's talk about that a little bit. This is a project on the right top where initially they had the straw rolls in a horseshoe shape that concentrated the stormwater discharge, increasing erosion and pollutant releases off-site. When we came in, we did the exact opposite. We put in a chevron-shaped compost sock, which keeps the water spread out and makes it less erosive. And so on this project on the right, 2 photos, this is a floodplain project where the traditional methods of straw and straw rolls were placed in the floodplain. So that's inappropriate. Is it appropriate to put compost blanket in the floodplain? No. So we have to have good designs. And as Peter has mentioned, Rescape California has certified designers. So I would hope that municipalities start requiring an increase in qualified designers. And also projects should be done when irrigation can get the plants established before the rainy season and any threat of a first flush. Irrigation is a key component. And you can see that there was a sprinkler head in that last slide that never got used because the project was delayed and implemented in the rainy season when everything washed away. So that's a big part of the successful project. In this photo, it's almost like the grasses are saying, please give me more compost and I will be your water quality protection surpassed by none other. Good vegetation is what happens with a good compost installation. And so that correlates to water quality. So we want to make sure that during inspection installation, the specified rates are truly followed. And inoculants such as beneficial mycorrhizae that work with grasses during establishment, they are a living commodity that needs to be protected and installed properly. This photo shows a mound of compost, which is bursting with thistles and brassicas. And I'm theorizing that because there's no beneficial mycorrhizae there, the weeds thrived. The hill in the background has grasses and no weeds because it has the beneficial mycorrhizae. And this simply shows the theory of an operation and maintenance requirement on establishing projects to a sustainable point. The yellow area represents the theoretical need for a year 2 application of organic fertilizer to make sure that the plants get sustainably established while the compost starts to kick in through time. And last slide, studying the hydrology, the photo on the left shows all the parking lot runoff going to a depressed area with ornamental grasses that demand lots of chemical fertilizer to stay green and lots of mowing maintenance. And there's probably a drain down there quickly discharging nutrient loads to our water bodies. Whereas the picture on the right shows more of a sheet flow condition that has a no-mow creeping red fescue and a low nitrogen need. And the water has a more of a torturous time finding a discharge in that design on the right. And so ultimately we want the general to say water quality is protected by successfully building projects that utilize compost, if all goes well. And that's the last slide I have, Angel.
Thank you very much. That was very informative. At this time, we will be taking questions for both Peter and David to answer. So please type your question in the questions page or email your questions to organics@calvarycycle.ca.gov.
Thank you, Angel. Our first question is from Leah Webb of the Mammoth Lakes area. They are asking about the potential use for biosolids post-fire or for fire prevention. They are looking for ways to use their surplus biosolids locally rather than exporting.
Peter, do you have any comment on that?
David, you want to take that one?
Peter, do you have any comment on that? Well, I'm going to vote for.
Can you hear me?
Go ahead, Peter.
Yeah, I don't have a lot of experience using biosolids. I know that it can be useful in some situations, but there are issues with contaminants in biosolids sometimes too. So it really depends on the quality of the biosolids.
The next question also regards fire control. They point out that regulations ensure mulch is tilled into soil within specified time periods. They want to know, should it be tilled in or left alone? And then the same with compost, if it should be tilled in or left alone.
Well, I always prefer compost be tilled in myself.
I'm having a little trouble. Yeah, I'm sorry that you were breaking up a little bit there during the, so I'm going to turn off my camera. Maybe it's my connection here.
Oh, David, were you going to say something in response?
Well, yeah, my main thought was that compost being tilled in is always preferable in my book because it's incorporated and creates more of a soil profile that it's amending the actual soil instead of just being on top. It's better not to have an interface where the growing media on top is separate from the subsoil. So I like to see it incorporated generally, less threat of movement and so forth.
If Peter didn't have anything to add to that, the next question is for them. Microplastics, which can't be seen with the naked eye, are likely also a problem in municipal composts. Is there an established monitoring and rating program or labs where you can send samples to understand the microplastic content of compost before purchase?
And I'm not going to know much about that. The only thought I know about the waste or the contaminants in compost is that the EPA has a standard, and I believe the standard is something like 1% by weight. I think it is. Maybe it's volume, but there is a tolerance that's allowed, and I don't have much more comment beyond that.
Peter, do you have anything to say about microplastics and compost?
Okay, the next question is from Laurentine Brazil. They ask, how many commercial composting facilities utilize a tilted floor and covers within California to capture the leachate in order to be recycled?
I don't know the answer to that either, but I'm certain that as increasingly facilities are being permitted, this direction is going to be more of the norm than what's historically been happening. And I think I read recently that there are 6 facilities that were given the notice of non-applicability in which they did not have to have the permit because of their advanced design in California.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, we
Yeah.
can.
Okay. All right. Sorry, I think something was wrong with my microphone before. And I'm having trouble hearing the questions too a little bit, but I wanted to say something about microplastics in compost. That was one of the questions, right? Plastics in general are a big problem in compost, and there's a lot of different aspects to it. There's the, quote unquote compostable plastics, which can be compostable in some situations, but most compost processors have a real hard time distinguishing between what's a technically compostable plastic and what is not. The labeling is oftentimes very difficult to deal with or notice or see. The colors, sometimes, they try to use a certain color, but then other plastics that are petroleum based use that same color. And then as they break down in the compost process, they turn into smaller and smaller pieces. So when we were in Emeryville, we kind of embraced compostable plastics in 2008 with our foodware ordinance. And then it kind of turned into a big mess because we ran into all these issues of labeling and trying to determine what was actually compostable and was not, and if our compost processor could actually deal with those plastics, and getting mixed material from all different sources. And you have some products that claim to be compostable, but they're not certified. So it's the whole issue of compostable plastics, in my mind, is a big problem. And what happens a lot of times at the compost facilities is they just end up screening out everything, and it all goes to landfill. And so people may be spending extra money because these compostable plastic products are more expensive than regular petroleum plastic sometimes. So they spend extra money thinking they're doing the right thing, and then it ends up going to the landfill anyway, where then it actually can turn into methane in the landfill and cause more problems than a petroleum-based plastic. So there's a lot of issues that we're going to need to work out, and there's a lot of pressure on product manufacturers and the petroleum industry to quote unquote green up their products and respond to the public's concern about plastics getting into the oceans and getting into the environment. So they're trying to figure out a way to make their products greener, but it's really not working in my mind. So
Yeah.
Peters, since you're having trouble hearing the questions, I can copy and paste into the chat box. If you could please get your, thank you.
Yeah, there was also a question about compost incorporation into soil, and I was going to say that if you're doing no-till farming, then I agree with David that tilling compost into the soil can be very useful if your soil has been compromised in the past, and maybe it's compacted, or maybe it has low nutrients, and in that situation you probably do need to till it in. But if you have already some decent fertility in the soil, and you can use compost as a top dressing, and the water and other microbes will it'll get down into the soil that way. So there are different, it depends on the situation.
Yeah, if nothing else, the gophers will bring it down there, as we saw in the previous.
Yeah, so we heard about this morning, right? That's great.
Thank you. Priscilla Garcia asks, if perfluorooctanoic acid, or PFOAs, is found in water, and if so, is it harmful?
Angel, could you repeat the question, please?
Sorry, I'm having trouble finding the question. Ray, do you mind repeating the question?
The question is from Priscilla Garcia, and they ask, and it is posed to David, if perfluorooctanoic acid, or PFOAs, is found in water, and if so, is this harmful?
It's an increasing concern that is being looked at. I don't have much experience with that, but it's pretty ubiquitous and a growing concern that's being looked at, but I wouldn't have much comment on that.
The next question from Jennifer Auletta is, if you are using a compost sock on a pervious surface or for a temporary use at a construction site, what do you do when finished?
Oh, I think I heard the rest of this after it cut out, but you know, the thing that's nice about a compost sock is that when the temporary need is over, if there's a polypropylene sock, it can be cut open and disposed of. And then the compost can be incorporated into the landscape under most conditions when the sock was merely catching sediments or other conventional pollutants. But there are socks that are available in the biodegradable state using cotton and other natural products. And so those can be fully incorporated onto the project in different ways without disposing of anything at the landfill.
Thank you. For roadside erosion control design, do you think hydroseed should be covered by a compost blanket 1 to 2 inches thick for more success?
So a lot of folks become concerned that seeds can't make it through compost applications. And, you know, there is the question of what size seed are we talking about? Is like a yarrow seed that's very small and a little BB, or is it more of a larger grass seed that has more energy to push through? So the threat of being snuffed out shouldn't be ignored, but based on empirical, you know, field experience, I'm not too concerned about compost over seeds as a rule. But there's, you know, a lot of times compost has seeds incorporated into it, which, you know, is maybe a challenge to successfully do depending on situations. But it's okay also to hydroseed on top of the compost in applications, and the seeds are protected short term by the hydro mulching, and then the seeds can get their roots down into the compost profile. So I think different scenarios can work. Compost on seeds or hydroseeding on compost can be successful, or seeds incorporated into the compost that's blown onto the site. That can work too.
The next question from Ian McCall. They would like to know, what is the difference between composted mulch and traditional mulch?
Well, composted mulch is going to be going through the windrow process where the heat is elevated to at levels that kill pathogens and the weed content in the compost. And then you can screen off the larger particles and create a mulch that has now been sterilized through the heat process. And so it's a different product that way. And it's partially starting to break down, so it may absorb moisture better and so forth. Peter, you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I can add some comments to that. So we worked on this composted wood mulch specification for biotreatment areas. We worked together with Ron Alexander, who is a great source of information on compost specifications in the United States and has worked with a lot of municipalities and government agencies. And he was telling me that when you put wood mulch through a composting process, the fungi and the bacteria will break down some of the oils that are in the wood. And so that can affect its flammability. It can also affect its floatability. And so that's one beneficial thing, because when you're working with biotreatment areas, you don't want the mulch to float as much. And one of the other differences, so uncomposted mulch is basically when you take tree trimmings or other landscape materials or just wood and you grind it up. And so it's uncomposted. It's just kind of shredded or ground material. And then sometimes they will take certain parts of that, like say the bark, and just use the bark and make a bark mulch, or just use the fiber from certain things to make like the gorilla hair kind of mulch. So it's a more of a fibrous mulch. So wood, there's all different types of wood products and wood and different parts of trees that can be made into different types of mulches. But the composted mulch, as David said, there's different ways to make it. You can also just take a clean kind of green landscaping, let's say what we call arbor mulch, is just chipped or shredded tree trimmings, and you can take that material and compost it, and now you've got a composted wood mulch that's gone through that process of to reduce pathogens. Composting the wood mulch can also kill sudden oak death disease, so that's a beneficial. We don't want to be spreading disease by spreading mulch around. So there are a lot of benefits, and as David said, you're also inoculating that wood mulch with beneficial microorganisms. That's good for the landscape, and it absorbs water and moisture, so it's heavier and doesn't float as much, and can also then protect the soil from drying out, and can help keep your soil cool too. So there's all these benefits of wood mulch, and then the composted wood mulch is even better in our perspective.
Yeah.
All right, well, I think that is all that we have time for our panel. So that concludes our panel. Thank you for everyone who submitted a question. And a big thank you to Peter and David for coming to present and answering our questions. We will now take a 5-minute break. Please join us back at 11 a.m. And until then, we have some things for your consideration. Thank you.
Okay, we'll get started with the last panel of this fantastic webinar. I am Tim Hall, the supervisor in the organics unit at CalRecycle. Sarah Gronquist and Chelo Siki from Rescape will close us out with a discussion of compost use in urban landscapes to meet MWELO and SB 1383. And I'm waiting for my panelists to turn on their cameras. Sarah Gronquist is the Rescape Board of Directors Secretary and landscape architect. She's particularly interested in places where people live, whether the site is a private residential garden exquisitely tailored to the owners or a multi-unit housing development that creates space for an entire community to grow. Recently, Sarah has been passing her experience on to the next generation of landscape architects through intensive review courses for LAIR candidates preparing for the licensure exam. Chelo Siki is the owner of and principal landscape architect of Land4 Landscape Architecture. He's been professionally designing and building landscapes with a focus on sustainability since 2003. Chelo holds a BS in environmental horticultural science from California Polytechnic State University, San Luis Obispo. Chelo is a Rescape lead instructor and chair of the horticulture department at American River College, where he teaches landscape and irrigation design and construction courses. Sarah and Chelo will also have a couple guest speakers towards the end of their presentation. With that, please join me in welcoming Sarah and Chelo.
Good morning, everybody. What a fantastic 2 days this has been. I am going to jump right in because we are feeling like we have a lot we want to tell you about. And then let's see, who is advancing the slides? Is it me?
That's me, Kim. Sarah, sorry, I was thinking about.
Could you give me the next slide, please? We are going to talk about practical uses of compost and mulch. And we're going to tie it to some legislation that you may be wondering about, SB 1383. A lot of people have been talking about MWELO. We're going to get into a little bit more detail about that. So go ahead and give me the next slide. If you aren't familiar with Rescape, we are a nonprofit. And Rescape's origins are actually of interest. It's been great to hear people talking about keeping green waste out of landfills today. Back in the 2000s, Alameda County came up with a program specifically aimed at trying to keep green waste out of landfills, and it grew into a much more holistic and comprehensive nonprofit, which is where we are at today with Rescape. At this moment in time, Rescape functions as a sort of a hub. We are constantly looking into sustainability and practices that are implementable and work with people's budgets and the way that landscapes are actually built. We provide trainings, we provide support to cities and municipalities, policy guidance, and generally we're just trying to connect people and inform them and support them around issues that relate to sustainability, including workforce training. We do a lot of trainings, I'll show you in a minute, for maintenance staff and designers and permit checkers. Climate equity issues are increasingly part of this work. And then, of course, looking at advocacy and policy and trying to figure out how to make effective legal environments for people to work within. We could go ahead to slide 7. You can skip the next 3 slides. Thank you. So Rescape is pretty uniquely positioned to talk about some of these issues. We're going to move pretty quickly through the topics that are summarized here. I'm going to give you a very brief summary of what Rescape does and what it has to offer for designers and maintenance staff, city staff, permit checkers. We're going to talk just a little bit about compost and mulch, although that's been covered very competently in the last couple days. And we're going to tie it into SB 1383 and MWELO. And then Chelo and I have 3 case studies that we'd like to show you. If you've been longing for some pictures and a little bit less data, we're going to have some pictures for you. And I'm going to show you how, as a designer, as a landscape architect, I was able to make compost happen in a manageable and measurable way. And then, of course, at the end, we'll have Q&A. Go on to the next slide. Rescape's founding principles are interrelated and each supports the others. People have been talking a lot about this already, but we're basically trying to build local networks and act locally, reduce waste. You'll remember that was one of our founding principles. Nurture the soil. Sequestering carbon was added just 2 years ago to our principles as it's becoming increasingly important. Save water, obviously, conserve energy, protect water and air, and create habitat. So I'm not going to talk about all of these, but I think you'll see as I continue how they tie together. Go on to the next slide. As part of our outreach and support, we offer a number of qualifications. And I'm not going to go through these in too much detail because you can contact Rescape after today and find out all about these. But I just want to show you there's a design qualification for landscape architects or garden designers. Go on to the next slide. We also have a maintenance qualification training that's aimed at people who are installing and maintaining landscapes. And in these trainings, we really try to be practical and give people tools that have been tested and proven. Go on to the next slide. We have a new firescaping qualification training that is very interesting. And we talk about some of these things that have been mentioned about how composts and having healthy soil can make landscapes more resilient and help them recover faster after a fire event. So that's a new training that we offer. Next slide, please. And really, one of the most important things that Rescape does is that since the very beginning, we have had a rating system that allows people to design to regenerative standards. And our rating system also provides documentation, and all through the process, we are going to be setting goals for sustainability. We're going to be collecting receipts and documentation. And then at the end, we're going to be measuring the results of the processes that we've been able to build into projects. So projects that earn a Rescape rating set pretty ambitious goals at the very beginning of the design process. And then we refine those and measure them all the way through. A Rescape rater goes out at the very end for a final punch walk, and they physically verify whether compost seems to be in the soils, whether sheet mulching was performed. A third-party auditor comes out and inspects the irrigation system and verifies that irrigation was properly installed. All of this is built into the Rescape rating system. It's a little bit like LEED. So we have core points that must be earned, and then additional points that projects can pursue in order to get the rating that leads to a successful Rescape rating. Next slide, please. There are 14 required practices that every rated landscape must incorporate. And I'm not going to read all of these, but a few of these should jump out for you. Protect all planting areas with mulch. Incorporate quality compost. I'll show you in a minute how we do that. Limit turf to recreational areas. Climate adapted plants that meet water budgets. Conduct irrigation audit. And then we have, as a specific required practice, you must meet your local MWELO. Local government, as you know, has the right to define how they will implement MWELO, and there's a little bit of variation from place to place. Let's have the next slide. So Rescape, or Bay Friendly as we started out, has been around for about 15 years, and we've gathered a lot of data. And so by now we know, and this is, you've been hearing this from everyone, we know there are some measurable benefits to this approach for landscapes. 30 to 70% maintenance labor savings. A lot of that comes out of minimizing turf and supporting plant growth, healthy plant growth with living soils. 50 to 90% water savings compared to a conventional landscape. Very good weed suppression without herbicides. And then we're always trying to find out how much greenhouse gas reduction are we managing. And that's a little harder to measure, but we have some tools that are tied to the amount of compost that we use and other factors that I'm not going to go into today. There's a lot here. Let's go on to the next slide. So the final piece here that I just want to show you, I think Rescape's goal is to be able to provide support to people that need it as we move into the next phase of sustainable construction in California. Rescape has been designed, the rating system has been designed to include things that are required by MWELO. And it also includes many things that are required by SB 1383, which is the new legislation that requires compost and mulch use per capita in cities. And I'll show you that in a little bit more detail in a few minutes, but I just wanted to give you a big picture look at how a Rescape rated landscape can help you plug into these other things that you need to do and help you measure and verify that landscapes are actually being installed in compliance with these pieces of legislation. So at this point, I'm going to invite Chelo to come in and talk about compost. You're muted, Chelo.
Thank you, Sarah. Hello, everybody. So what I'm going to go through are ways that we actually can incorporate and use compost and mulches in the urban setting where our pollutant loads are typically much higher and where our stormwater volumes are always much higher. So we're really relying on these soils in our urban settings to be able to really perform well. So it's a very important piece. And typically we're dealing with smaller areas, little islands of parks or open spaces within the urban setting that we are, where you have to be a little bit more nimble. As Carrie mentioned this morning, on a large property, there's several different methods for executing these projects. On very small areas, you really need to consider the best methods to be able to do that. So Heather, if you could advance the slide, please. Thank you. So as everybody's been mentioning, compost, primarily about compost so far, but compost and mulch really do nurture soils. We've had a lot of info on that, so I'm not going to go into the details on it, but we know that compost and mulch really performs this well. If you can jump to slide 21, Heather. There we go. So question really is, how do we do it and how much within the urban setting? I'm going to talk about compost first and then go into mulches. And I do have to thank David and Peter, the earlier presenters that really went into some great information on mulches. So Heather, if you can advance, please. So diving into best practices for methods of incorporating compost into soil or onto soil, which it then goes into soil, there's really two ways to address it, either top dressing the soils or mechanical incorporation. So top dressing, there's several methods to be able to do it. And then mechanical incorporation is really sort of the traditional method of tilling the soil to a certain depth, applying compost, and then tilling to incorporate that compost. If you can go to the next slide, Heather. So considerations that you should be thinking about when you're deciding how you're going to actually apply the compost itself. So you want to think about the age of the landscape. Is this a brand new landscape installation, or is it a mature landscape? What are the existing soil and site conditions? Is the soil compacted? Does it have any structure? Are there any signs of life within that soil? And that's going to help you decide whether you should be tilling and amending or top dressing. Also thinking about the plants. How mature are the plants? Are there mature plants present? What types of plants are present? What's the density of those plantings? So lawn or dense ground cover areas, you're probably not going to want to till those areas. You need to find a different way to be able to incorporate that compost into those areas. Next slide, please, Heather. So for newly planted areas, which method do you use? So if you look at a brand new area that's going to be planted, does it have dead soil? Is there any sign of life? Is it imported subgrade fill soil? Is it a cut into subgrade? Are there proposed dense plantings like sod or any creeping ground cover? Typically, this is the time when you are going to till, amend, and then till to incorporate. Because if there's no life in that soil already, the tilling activity really isn't jumbling up that life in the soil. Okay, so if the life isn't already there, we want to be able to accelerate that that system buildup, and we can do that. And it's relatively safe to do that by tilling, which is the fastest way to approach it. Heather, if you can jump to the next slide. So if you're working on a soil that in an area that's proposed to be planted, but the soil's showing signs of life, and it's going to be sort of normal plantings, 1 gallons, 5 gallons, 15-gallon pots, etc., then place the appropriate amount of compost on top of the soil and cover it with 3 inches of mulch. If it's a heavy clay soil, or if there's areas of compaction, it could really benefit from fracturing that soil instead of tilling it up. If germination of dormant weed seeds is potential, which it generally is after any kind of landscape activity, then think about sheet mulching to be able to suppress those weeds. Be sure to plant, if you're taking this approach, make sure that you are planting your plants, the root balls of those plants, at an appropriate level in relation to the soil grade, so that you can accept that compost and mulch layer. Sometimes we're at 3 inches, 4 inches, 5 inches above with that layer, so we need to address that so we're not killing out these new plants. Heather, if you can jump to the next slide. So for our mature areas, as opposed to newly planted areas, this is where we really want to consider, do we need to till? Typically, we don't. For dense planting areas, such as lawn or creeping ground cover areas, do a core aeration and then add fine screen compost to fill those voids created. You can also use specialized soil fracturing equipment and add fine textured compost in the same method for larger areas. I learned this from a buddy of mine that is a golf course superintendent, and for his fairways that are adjacent to his ponds, he uses this method because he wants to make sure that he's keeping fertilizers out of those ponds. This picture in the lower right is a picture of a toe behind fracture that's actually a really amazing one. So besides the dense plantings, looking at landscape beds and planting areas, just place the appropriate amount of compost on top of that soil, cover it with 3 inches of mulch. Again, you can fracture that soil, and then again, make sure that we're not piling organic material above root crowns on existing plants, okay? Taper that down, be aware of what's there and the adjustment to grade that's coming. Heather, if you can jump to the next slide, please. So how much do we add? I think as Holly said yesterday, it's going to depend. Generally, we want to add enough compost to be able to bring our soil's organic content up to 5%, okay? A soils analysis is going to be able to tell us how much that actually is. And then when we're looking at ongoing maintenance applications, adding a 1/2 inch to 1 inch of fine screen to planting areas on a yearly basis is a really great way to maintain that health in the soil. Next slide, please. So a lot of ways to recognize, I know that we talked a lot about compost, but in terms of like recognizing and feeling that compost, there's a lot of bullet points here, but really, if you smell that compost, it should smell like the forest floor after a first rain, right? A really concentrated version of that smell tells you that that's a good compost to use. Next slide, please. Don't use weed mat. Just skip the weed mat. It really creates a barrier between the organic content that we're putting onto this soil and the soil itself, okay? There's many reasons not to use it. Please don't use it. If weeds are a concern, use cardboard instead. Next slide, please. Also, there's been some talk of California natives, and a lot of California natives prefer very low organic content. A lot of California natives prefer very low nitrogen. So keep an eye out, look for composters that produce low nitrogen compost. I know several of them that do, so look around for those ones if that's the case. Next slide, please. So diving into mulch best practices, things that you want to consider with mulch. Will the surrounding surfaces accept that added material? If you're going to add 3 inches of mulch, make sure that it's not going to fall onto sidewalks, etc. Also, you're going to want to consider existing plant density, existing shrub or perennial canopy spreads. That's going to kind of make, you know, laying mulch down onto a newly planted area goes really quick. Putting mulch down into existing planting areas is a much slower process. You need to be very careful with it, so it's going to take more time. Take that into consideration when you're planning these applications. Next slide, please. Generally, 3 inches or more of an organic recycled mulch on all planting areas. Exceptions, obviously, on turf or creeping ground cover areas, and where there's beneficial insect habitats. Don't pile it up against existing root crowns. Modify those grades adjacent to hardscape sidewalks, etc. For larger areas, blow the mulch in, blow the compost in. Okay, it's a really efficient way to do it. Ongoing maintenance, just maintain that 3 inch layer of mulch. I have a lot of clients that say, when am I supposed to do it? They want to know a day. Well, I can't tell you a day, but go and look. And if there's not 3 inches of mulch, put enough there to keep 3 inches there. Generally on a yearly basis. Next slide, please. Thanks, Dave.
Halo, just wanted to let you know you're about halfway through.
Got it. Thank you. So here's a detail of how to make sure that that mulch is not falling onto sidewalks. General public doesn't like it when mulch is on sidewalks and they decide they don't like mulch. That's not really the problem. Here's a detail to make sure that that mulch does not fall onto sidewalks. Next slide, please. Similar detail for adding mulch adjacent to lawn areas. Next slide, please. There's MWELO requirements for mulch, and in the next slide, if you could advance, Heather. This is second to last slide until I jump back to Sarah. Really, a good mulch should be recycled organic wood chips with minimal bark. Okay, that means that gorilla hair, shredded cedar, and fir bark are not. These are virgin materials. Okay, and these don't nurture the soil. Next slide, please. So a good mulch should provide the following 3 benefits: reduce evaporation, mitigate soil temperature fluctuations, and break down into the soil. And the gorilla hair, shredded cedar, and fir bark will not break down into the soil. And so that's the end of my first portion. Sarah, jump back in, please.
Great. Let's have the next slide. We love composted mulches. That is really a great thing that's available. I just wanted to show you briefly a little bit more about MWELO. I know it's been around for a while. It was established in the 90s. And it just continues to get more comprehensive over time. And as we'll see in a minute, water conservation is here to stay. And many cities and municipalities in California are struggling with their MWELO obligations. You may know that in 2019, many cities were sued for failing to comply with their MWELO reporting responsibilities. We're trying to give you some tools and some support to help you with that. There's a lot of technical information in MWELO that may be challenging for plan checkers. Let's go on to the next slide. MWELO obviously is about water calculations and reducing our water use. There are a few other things that you might not know that are in MWELO. MWELO requires a soil management report, a soil test. It requires compost, as Chela mentioned. It requires mulch cover. Of course, an irrigation plan is required. A grading design plan is also required. And there are some other things here. We mentioned the third-party audit that Rescape includes in our rating system. That is there because it's an MWELO requirement. So it all gets folded in to the Rescape system. But of course, if you're doing your own plan checking, you can do all these things on your own. Next slide, please. It's been a while since we've had MWELO, and I've been a practicing landscape architect for about 25 years. And I can tell you that over that time period, we see a marketplace for compost and mulch and smart irrigation and smart controllers that's much more robust. A lot of really amazing tools that we did not have at the beginning of this process. So there's a lot of good news here. But there are still some challenges that we're trying to contend with. And these are just going to get more important as time goes on. We're going to talk to you a little bit at the very end about the new MWELO guidebook that Kim O'Kane is preparing for DWR at the very end of the presentation. So I'm going to go on for now. Next slide, please. So let's look at SB 1383 just very briefly. SB 1383 requires that we work to do our best to divert organics from landfills and recover edible food. Why are we trying to do this? Because landfills are a significant source of methane, and methane is a huge driver for climate change. There are things we could be doing with our green waste that are much more useful, like making it into compost and mulch. And this legislation has already taken effect. Cities in California are required in 2022 to use a certain amount of compost and mulch, and you can use it for anything you want. The targets are by resident per capita. And so the folks that we work with are trying to get a handle on what this is going to mean for them as they move forward. Let's have the next slide. I just wanted to show you very briefly, I know the most about Alameda County because that's where most of my design practice happens. Alameda County has developed a pretty interesting GIS database. All of the cities and municipalities in Alameda County, there's some unincorporated county land, came together to map out all of the open space and publicly maintained landscapes in the county. And this allows us to start looking at application rates for compost, maintenance practices, and it's turning out to be a really wonderful planning tool for Alameda County. And if you're interested in this, I can't talk about it too much due to time, contact us and we'd be happy to connect you with Stop Waste, who's leading this effort. Next slide, please. All right, we've come to the case studies, and let's go on and look at a multifamily housing development in Sunnyvale, California. And I got to go really fast. I apologize, folks. So this is about a 3-acre property. It was an existing property built in the 80s. The owners wanted to renovate for market competitive reasons, really. Next slide, please. And we've just got some befores and afters here. I don't need to talk about it too much, but of course, in the 80s, we just used lawn everywhere. And this new design, this is the only turf panel in this whole development, and it's placed between the public pool and a cabana where it's really valuable and used by the most residents. We have replaced all of these foundation plantings with low water use plants. And let's have the next slide. I've got a few here for you to look at. Chelo was talking about looking at the soils as you're developing your compost strategy. On the left, we have a picture of sterile soils that were maintained in old school ways with conventional fertilizers, and there's not very much going on in these soils. Because this site had a lot of mature trees, we used a combination of tilling and top dressing, and we were aiming to get to 5% by volume in the top 8 inches of soil for this project. You can see in the after picture how much the plants are enjoying their new soil. And this is something that's going to be maintained on an annual basis with testing and top dressing as we move forward. Next slide, please. Here's just another picture of these narrow areas with lots of trees. So here's a situation where we might need to look at top dressing instead of tilling. It has worked very well on this project. These aren't exactly the same viewpoint. I wasn't able to find perfect befores and afters, but I think you get the idea. Let's have the next slide. How did we do this? I'm going to just show you a little bit more specifically than some of our previous panelists have been able to do. We defined the quality of compost and the quantities that we wanted in the specifications. And we also defined how we were going to verify that. I mentioned that we were tilling and top dressing. Let's go on to the next slide. Here is an example of the specification that we wrote for this project. And this is just a little piece of it, but I think this is going to be of interest to you. So we're requiring a soil test, and we tell them that the soil test should come back with organic amendment recommendations. This is really important. The soil labs don't have an opinion about what you should use, but they won't give you organic amendment recommendations unless you ask for it. In this case, we also required that OMRI certified products be used. The Organic Materials Research Institute has a database where they rate products and they tell you whether they are organic or not. Your contractor can go and look up this database. You can go and look up this database. It provides a really good baseline for all of these materials. We also required organic compost as a soil amendment. And we said compost shall be tested through the U.S. composting councils. USCC provides very good testing standards. Again, it's an easy way for the contractor to know that they've met your standard, and it's an easy way for you to check the quality of the material. Let's go on to the next slide. And I just compiled some of these very quickly. I guess in the interest of time, I'm not going to talk about this too much, but I thought it was interesting. Let's go on and look at our next project because we're getting short on time. Here is a city park that was done in Alameda, and they had the opportunity to convert an abandoned rail line into a public park. They had contaminated soils, soils that had run fallow for a long time. And so we intensely sheet mulched this project and used a lot of compost. Where there was soil contamination, we had to put in a physical barrier with the old soil under a fabric and some new soil brought in to support plant growth. Next slide, please. And some more before and afters here. This whole site was intensively mulched to try to get the weeds down and rebuild some of the soils. Because it's such a large project, the city has chosen to maintain a lot of it with just bark mulch or, wood shredded mulch under native trees. So this is a very low water use, low maintenance way of dealing with some of these areas that aren't going to be intensively used. Obviously around the playground, they're putting in more water and maintenance investment. Next slide, please. Just one more before and after. I'm not going to talk about this too much. This is a pretty recent project. It was finished in 2019 in the end of the year. So we're looking forward to seeing how it performs over time. Next slide, please. And just, here's another pair of pictures for you to look at. The playground is very popular now that it's open. Next slide, please. And again, just to show you how we made this connection. So this was a Rescape rated project. The first one I showed you was not. Again, in the plans and the specifications, the Rescape rater worked with the design team to make sure that these requirements were clear and they were included before the project was bid. So everybody was on the same page. The plans and specs required the soil analysis, they required compost amending, they required sheet mulching. We told them where to get the recycled cardboard and how to put it down. The mulch cover was spelled out. And on the right here, we have an example of what you'll get back on a project like this. Here's a lab analysis of compost component of biotreatment soil mix. I went into the old project files and just tried to pull something. I'm going to show you in a minute what was in the spec. The contractor is going to bring you this, and then you can take your spec and you can take what they've submitted and look at them side by side and see very easily whether your products are compliant. Let's go on to the next slide. I should have put these in the other order, but here's the kind of information we included in our spec. And this is a model spec that Rescape provides that has very practical, detailed descriptions of what a quality compost should look like if you get a test result back from a contractor. Everybody likes certainty in the process. During a Rescape rated project, all of these things will be submitted before they're installed. The receipts are collected and the quantities are verified. And then, as I mentioned before, there's a final site visit to verify that everything is actually the way it should be. Next slide, please. And again, just some facts. This is a much larger project. If the city had been trying to meet their SB 1383 commitments, they would have been able to put a lot of compost on the balance sheet here. It's nice to be able to identify new projects that are coming in your planning. Let's go on to the next slide.
Sarah,
Sheila can do this one. Yep.
I just wanted to let you guys know you've got 5 minutes.
All right, very good.
Okay.
Shayla, you're up.
Shaylo, you're muted. Okay.
Oh, he's been muted by someone else. Can you unmute him?
Thank you very much. And Tim, thanks, Sarah, and Tim, thanks for the heads up. So I'm just going to go really briefly through a residential project in Penryn, California. This was a pretty large scale project. They have a lot of acreage, and clearly this is, it was a very neat project to work with. Next slide, please. So we had a situation where we ended up bringing in a significant amount of fill outlined in blue. You see area that the grade wasn't necessarily disturbed from what was previously there. The area outlined in red was about 500 plus yards of fill soil. The fill soil was a subgrade soil, so there was no organic content, there was no life in it. So we really needed to consider significantly how we're actually going to make these two areas sort of match up, because it was a uniform planting. The area in blue, we did 3 inches of compost tilled in, and then the area it circled in red which was the fill area. We actually brought in 6 inches of compost and got that tilled in incredibly deep, actually pre-mixed with the top 12 inches. And then we actually had biochar added to this compost. And the goal was to really accelerate the buildup of the soil life within that area so that these 2 areas would match. Next slide, please. So ultimately, the result, you get a really uniform appearance out of these areas. So by using that extra amount of compost and then adding the biochar to it, we really ended up with excellent results. I think this picture is probably taken a year and a half ago. This thing really hasn't changed much at all. So a good way to really consider how we can incorporate these organic materials to be able to get our landscapes to perform really well. So that being said, I'm going to hand this off to Kim O'Kane, and she's going to talk a little bit about MWeLo.
Great, thank you. Hi, thanks so much. If you can go to the next slide, that'd be great. So just wanted to let everyone know that Rescape is developing a new toolkit of very affordable services for cities and counties of any size to really help them comply with MWeLo and SB 1383. And so what we're looking to do is provide administration of MWeLo plan check, inspections, and annual reporting. Next slide. And we're also going to provide policy consulting to help you with any of your existing policies or new policies that you want to implement and customize training. Next slide. And then we're also going to provide, or we do this already, but if you want to include this in your city or county, is provide training for landscape professionals, your own plan check and inspection staff, and any of your applicants. And this can all be customized as well. And then last slide, we also want to offer a slew of public education and outreach, whether that's a webinar or different collateral, to help your public understand why MWeLo and SB 1383 are so important and how they can comply. So we're going to be going out in February, letting cities and counties know about these services and getting your feedback so we can provide the best services possible. So you can find out more at rescapeca.org. Thanks.
Great. We have one more surprise speaker. Very briefly, Karina Herrera is a scientist with the State Water Board, and she's going to talk very briefly about SB 606 or AB 1668.
Hi, yeah, thanks. So just quickly wanted to give you guys an overview of some of the work we're doing at the State Water Board. So SB 606 and AB 1668 are these 2 bills that established a new foundation for long-term improvements in water conservation and drought planning to adapt to climate change and the resulting longer and more intense droughts in California. Beginning in 2024, each urban retail water agency will annually calculate what's called an urban water use objective based on water use efficiency standards that will be adopted by the State Water Board. And on the next slide, we have an infographic showing generally how the objective would be calculated. The 2 standards pertaining to outdoor water use are the residential outdoor standard and the standard for CI&I landscapes with dedicated irrigation meters. These standards will incorporate the principles of MWeLo, which you've heard a little bit about today. And part of the water conservation work includes ensuring Californians continue to make smart gardening choices. Replacing turf-dominant landscapes with gardens that are efficiently irrigated with climate-appropriate plants is critical. And also critical is the application of compost and mulch because of the many benefits that you've heard today, including reducing evapotranspiration. So with these new efficiency standards coming into place, suppliers will be making choices about how to best promote water use efficiency amongst their customers. And this will hopefully incorporate the application of compost and mulch. And so we can share additional info if you're interested in learning more. Thanks.
So we are out of time. Sarah and Chelo, do you want to spend 30 seconds just kind of wrapping up, and then we'll move to the question and answer portion.
I feel like we covered everything briefly, and if people want to ask questions, of course, we're here for that. All of these water conservation goals really go hand in hand with the use of compost and mulch. So hopefully that's clear.
Okay, thank you. So we will have our question and answer session now. And just a reminder, if you're using GoToWebinar, type a question or a summary of your question into the question pane. We will not be using the raise hand function. And if you're watching via the Cal EPA broadcast, you can email your questions to organics@calrecycle.ca.gov. So with that, Ray, do you have questions for the panel?
We do, but before we get into that, a quick note from a previous panel that CalRecycle has established physical contamination standards for compost, 0.5% by dry weight for physical contaminants and 0.1% for film plastics. Kyle Pogue, our Star Branch, believes that Caltrans mentioned yesterday that they have tighter specifications that many composters can meet. And with that, we will jump into our first question from Craig. They ask, how do you differentiate regenerative landscapes from sustainable landscapes?
I'm happy to talk about that. So, you know, in the past, we talked about sustainability. At Rescape, we've been having a lot of conversations about how do we take it a step past sustainability and how do we look at regenerating our landscapes. Particularly in an urban context, you have a lot of soils that are completely impervious. They're so compacted and dead. And we are feeling in this, 2022 environment that where we have the leverage to go beyond creating sustainability and working towards regeneration, we have a duty to do that.
Thank you, Sarah. The next question from Carrie Cow. They would like to know, is 5% organic content in the soil recommended for California native plants?
Chelo, do you want to field that?
Sure. It depends on which plants. Okay? There are California natives that are perfectly fine with a high organic content. And then there's a lot of California natives, namely a lot of the ones from soft chaparral. Prefer really low organic content. So I would recommend that in order to determine what percentage you need to bring it to, you're going to want to look at the native plant, the original native plant community that would have been on that site, and then what's actually being proposed within that site. And some great tools for that. There's a website, LosPolitas.com. It's a nursery out of Santa Margarita, and they actually have a plant community by zip information within that. It's going to depend on the plant material itself.
Great. The next question is, are there any engineered wood chips that are recycled mulch, or is it all virgin material?
Are you referring to engineered wood fiber for playgrounds? For playgrounds, I think it's all virgin wood because it has to meet ADA standards. It's a little hard without being able to talk to the asker. That's the only situation I can think of where you wouldn't really want to use a composted product for mulch.
The next question from Jeanette Kwong also doesn't specify what type of use, but the question is using walnut or nutshell mulch not recommended?
Never been asked that question, and to be honest, I've never considered it, but understanding that The nutshell portion is a protective coating, just like a bark. There's probably a significant amount of material in it that makes it very challenging for it to break down. We probably see evidence of that under walnut trees, that those nut shells take a long time to break down because their intent by that plant is to protect the seed. So my gut reaction on it would be, it's not going to hurt anything, but 100% nut shell mulch probably isn't going to be that great for nurturing the soil.
Our next question has a few components, so I'll split it up into two parts. The first is asking about any specifications for the volume of compost that should be used or incorporated based on soil type, compaction, and plant types and landscapes.
How do we figure out that? This sounds like it's about how much compost should we require to be delivered to the site. What it sounds like to me. And we would want to know that and figure it out and put it in the specs before anything really happens. So you have to decide how deep you're going to till if you're tilling. If you're not tilling, there are, you know, like we've got our 3-inch depth of top dressing standard, but that's probably a number that you'd want to think about for each project, depending on whether, you know, what your goals are.
And what the soils analysis says. The soils analysis is going to tell you the percentage organic matter, and then based on that, if it's currently 2% and you need to bring it to a 5%, it's going to give you a volume to be able to do that.
Yeah, the soils test is your friend. Really, really, we rely on that.
And it's very inexpensive and quick.
Thank you. The next portion is actually a request to share the names of material suppliers that you found where you can specify a low nitrogen compost. They've never seen it specified or marketed that way. They also shared their email address if you'd rather share those recommendations.
Yeah, absolutely. I think I'd prefer to email. So if you could forward that email on, that'd be great. But yes, it's not an easy find. It's also not an easy find to track down composters that provide composted mulch. Okay, you do have to do some hunting. So I'd be happy to email that.
The other thing I want to just remind people is that I'm really hoping we're going to see a flowering of amazing, good quality compost market available as these requirements come into place and cities start asking for quality compost and rejecting bad quality compost. The market may respond. That's what we saw in the 90s.
Okay, we have time for one more question. Do you have one for us, Ray?
Sure, we can jump to Corey Beavers. They asked, did Sunnyvale provide this compost to the developer for free?
No, it was part of the construction cost budget.
Since that was so quick, maybe one more.
Yeah, one more.
Okay, the last question is, after the required soil testing, how are the recommended amendments paid for once in construction?
It's part of the construction budget. So remember, the city is going to set standards, and then developers have to meet them, and designers are going to help them meet those standards. It's not like the 80s when I started practice. I won't tell you how old I am, where we were forcing people to think about this stuff. This is common practice now.
Okay, thank you, Sarah and J-Lo, as well as Kim and Karina. I am going to turn it back over to Heather to close us out.
Hello, everybody. Now I have posted a link to a survey we created to help us understand what you found helpful and what you might like to see in future webinars. We are so happy to be able to provide great content. We'd love to know what it is that you thought about what we did today. We will also send out a link to the survey to everyone who registered, along with some resources related to information from the webinar. If you were not registered and would like me to email you the resources or a link to the survey, please let me know. My email address is on the screen. The survey will be open until the 28th. So, please take a minute and know what you thought. And I just wanted to express my appreciation to all of our presenters. They have provided so much great information on how to best use compost. I hope everyone watching has a project or two in mind. Compost can help us rebuild our soil, increase the nutrition in the food we grow, improve our health, and get our climate back in balance, but only if we all pitch in and get the work done. We had a spectacular collection of people sharing their knowledge with us today, and I'm grateful to each and every one of them. And there are others out there. If you get stuck, reach out and find someone who can answer your questions. I bet there are a lot of brilliant, hardworking people in your community, and Jack and I are here for you as well, and the rest of the Caltrans and CalRecycle teams. The future is bright in a world with clean technology and conservation measures like low energy use household goods such as LED lights, zero emission cars, and of course, where banana peels and other organic material are being given a chance to improve our lives instead of rotting in a landfill and throwing our climate further off balance. A big thank you to all the folks who brought this webinar to you, the incredible presenters, the CalRecycle, I'm getting tongue-tied, guys, so sorry. The Caltrans teams, and thank you to everyone who joined us to learn about compost use today. I hope you have a great lunch and enjoy the rest of your day. Jack, any parting words?
Yeah, thank you, Heather. I just wanted to say, I hope you all learned a lot. Even putting this together with Heather, our two teams, Caltrans and CalRecycle, I learned a lot. So I hope you all got a lot of great benefit out of the 2-day webinar. We had some wonderful presenters. I really appreciate all of the presenters, their time, their expertise, and the valuable knowledge they gave to us. And I really appreciate the energy the entire team between Caltrans and CalRecycle has put together to put this on. Thank you all very much. And what really made this webinar super special was all of you sending in the questions. A couple of them were really good. It's going to take some of us to go back and do a little homework to analyze the question and come up with a reasonable response. Some of them maybe we don't even have the answer to yet. So great questions, really appreciate that. And I wanted to reach over to CalRecycle and just say thank you for the collaboration and the partnership you've done with us at Caltrans. The two state agencies connecting together, I think it's been phenomenal. And I look forward to what's to come in the future. So thank you.
Feeling is mutual. Look forward to work with you in the future.
Thanks, Heather.
Bye, everybody. Have a great day.
Bye, you guys. Thank you.